So,
Bezat Hashem, yeah.
Where are we?
We are holding today in Megillah on Zayin Amud Aleph, 7a,
7a.
top of the page, 7a,
It was the one of yesterday.
towards the top of the page. Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda is about 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines from the top of the page.
Okay.
Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. You see it?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have 2 sections in today's learning. The first section is actually a fascinating discussion here. We're going to get into a discussion regarding if Megillat Esther is part of Tanakh. And then we'll discuss other books as well. See, we look at it as, you pull out a Tanakh and all of the books that are there, so that was all included in Tanakh, but actually, it was all gathered across history, meaning Shlomo HaMelech wrote a few books, and David HaMelech wrote a few books, and Shmuel HaNavi, and it was all gathered together, and some books made the cut, and some books didn't make the cut, meaning someone else could have written a book, but that wasn't included in Tanakh. So we're going to see, and there's halachic differences based on that. We're going to see if Megillat Esther made the cut actually, and you'll assume it does because it's there, but we'll see. And in the second section, we'll start discussing this idea of matanot levyonim and mishloach manot. We'll get into those halachot and a couple of related stories, God willing. So the Gemara tells us as follows: Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda says, this is really a continuum from yesterday. Shmuel Bar Yehuda says, Shalcha lahem Esther l'chachamim. Esther sent a message. This seems to be in the 2nd year following the miracle of Purim. She sent a message to the Chachamim saying, Kav'uni ledorot. I want you to establish this miracle for future generations as the Chag of Purim. I want you to establish that there should be a mitzvah of Purim with Mikra Megillah, etc. So Shalchula, they sent back a message to her, Kina at me'oreret aleinu lebein ha'omot. You're going to create hatred. You're going to create jealousy, hatred amongst the nations against us. Because what are we doing? We're celebrating a day when the different nations of the world were destroyed or were fought against by the Jewish people, and the Jewish people won. What kind of a good message are we sending to... We're living amongst the Goyim. It's not like we're living, in Eretz Yisrael yet. We're living in Persia. We're living in... And we want us to create a holiday where we're going to read in shul and publicize the fact that we fought against the other nations and knock them down. That doesn't... It's not a good idea.
It's awkward.
Right. It's just a bad idea. So Shalcha lahem, so she said back to them, it's not a problem because Kfar K'tuva ani al devrei yamim lemalchei Madai uParas. It's already written in the chronicles of Madai and Paras. This is already written in the history books. They wrote it also in Madai and Paras. So therefore, there's no problem. You could establish it as a chag and it's not going to create an issue. Now the Gemara tells us a related discussion. Rav Chanina, Rav Yochanan, Rav Chaviva. So these 4 rabbis and the matnu, they all taught. Now before it tells us what they taught, the Gemara interjects and says, Bekule Seder Moed, wherever we have this group of rabbis, in Seder Moed, Megillah is in Seder Moed, in the order of Moed, Kol Ki Zuga, this entire grouping of rabbis, Chilufe Rabbi Yochanan U'Ma'al Rabbi Yonatan. So take out Rabbi Yochanan and insert Rabbi Yonatan. Really it meant to be Rabbi Yonatan. So what did they teach? That Shalcha lahem Esther l'chachamim. Esther sent another message to the Chachamim. She sent as follows: Katvuni ledorot. Now this is even more significant. She said, okay, beautiful. So you've agreed to establish the Chag of Purim, but now I'm asking you. Also, I want you to include Esther, Megillat Esther, as part of Nach. I want this to be included in. Should actually included in Ketuvim, but I want this to be included in the holy writings in Ketuvim. So Shalchula, they sent back a message to her. The reason we cannot do that is based on a pasuk in Mishlei. Now I want to just explain this outside and then we'll see it inside. We know that there are multiple times in the Torah, in Tanakh, where we discuss Melchemet Amalek. We discuss the war with Amalek.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No, it's okay. There are multiple times in Tanakh where we discuss the war with Amalek, which we know it begins, actually we have a reference to it, it begins in Sefer Shemot. We have another reference to it in Dvarim, Shmot, Dvarim, and then we have a reference to it in Shmuel, and that's 3 references essentially. So like this, the pasuk in Mishlei tells us, implies at least, that Milchemet Amalek is only meant to be written 3 times in Tanakh. So what the Chachamim are going to say to her is, you're asking us to record Megillat Esther as part of Tanakh. The problem is, Megillat Esther also includes Milchemet Amalek. How does it include that? Because essentially the pushback and fighting against Haman is also a similar idea, Milchemet Amalek. He was a descendant of Amalek. So we can't include it in Tanakh because the verse in Mishlei says you could only include Milchemet Amalek 3 times in Tanakh. Very interesting. It's very interesting how this is built because Mishlei was written by Shlomo HaMelech, but the reference is that Shlomo was saying it could only be written 3 times. It was already written 3 times, so you can't write it again. So let's see. So the Gemara says as follows. They sent back a message. Shalchula, they sent back to her. Pasuk in Mishlei says, Alo katavti lecha shalishim. In Mishlei it says, I will write it for you 3 times. Shalishim velo reveim, meaning is that Milchemet Amalek is meant to be written 3 times and not 4 times. So therefore they said we cannot record Megillat Esther. You can write it down if you want as a book, but you can't include it in Tanakh because that is inclusive of Milchemet Amalek and it's not meant to be written a 4th time.
Which one are the other 3 references?
So the first time is in Shemot. We actually had it recently, where the Amalek attacks. Well, so right. So the first time is when Amalek attack us when we leave Mitzrayim, which is recorded in Sefer Shemot. It's recorded again in Sefer Devarim. It's recorded again. And so that's 2 times in Torah, actually. We have a 3rd time where it's recorded in Shmuel. In Shmuel, when Shaul was meant to kill out Amalek, he fought with Agag, and he wasn't successful. That's 3 times. Is that 3 times? We can't record it again? Good. The fighting with Haman, exactly. So let's see. Until they found a verse that is written in the Torah. The pasuk says in Parashat Bishalach. This was their allowance to write down Megillat Esther. Why? Because the pasuk says as follows: Ketov zot zikaron basefer. Ketov. How do you read this pasuk? 1 second. Do you have the pasukim there on the side? I don't know if I read this properly. Let me look this up. It's at the end of Bishalach. 1 second. Hold on. I'm going to read it right. So at the end of Bishalach, which is also the incident in Shemot, where it talks about Milchemet Amalek, Hashem commands Moshe, Ketov zot zikaron basefer. Write this remembrance in a book. Basefer, in a book. So the pasuk says, Ketov zot zikaron basefer. Says the Gemara, so the Chachamim said like this. This is how we're going to break down this pasuk. Ketov zot zikaron basefer. Ketov zot, when it writes, write this. Mashe katuv kan, v'mishnat Torah. So that's what actually, see, that's what you're referring to. Ketov zot means you could write down Amalek 1 time, both kan, which is in Bishalach, which is in Shemot, Sefer Shemot, as well as in Mishnat Torah, which is in Devarim, it's in Kitavo actually. So the first reference that you could write it down 1 time is inclusive of the 2 times that it's written down in Torah, both in Sefer Shemot and Sefer Devarim. Zikaron, or remembrance, when it says that in the pasuk, Mashe katuv b'nevi'im. That's what's written in Nevi'im, which is in Shmuel Aleph, again with Shaul fighting against Agag and Amalek. But Basefer, the 3rd part of that pasuk, Mashe katuv b'Megilla. That's what's written in Megillat Esther. And actually, you do have a scriptural reference that you could write it down a 3rd time in the context of the way we're understanding it now. Which means there's another way to understand this. The way you could understand it now is the 2 times it's written in the Torah is essentially looked at as 1. So therefore you have 3 times you write it. It's twice in the Torah, 1 time in Nevi'im, which is in Shmuel, and 1 time in Ketuvim, which is Megillat Esther. Beautiful. So therefore they found the ability to record Megillat Esther for future generations as part of Tanakh. Says the Gemara Ketanai, but this is actually based on a machloket Tanaim. Because the pasuk, again, it tells us in a Bishalach, Ketov zot, the first of the Tanaim say like this, Ketov zot teaches us, Mashe katuv kan. What do you think that person's trying to accomplish by honking 10 times? You think someone's crossing the street, they're saying, look out?
No,
what do you think they're
waiting for somebody, just telling him to come.
Just telling him to go, right? Ketanai, so Gemara says it's machloket Tanaim. Ketov zot, the first part of that verse that says, write this, Mashe katuv kan. So the first of the Tanaim say, that's what's referenced here in Bishalach, here in Sefer Shemot. Zikaron, with the second part of the pasuk, Mashe katuv Mishnat Torah, that's what's written in Kitavo and Sefer Devarim. Basefer, now the last part of the verse, Ma shekatuv b'Nevi'im, that's what's written in Nevi'im, meaning in Shmuel Aleph, Divrei Rabbi Yehoshua. Now, according to Rabbi Yehoshua, you don't have a third scriptural reference to allow writing down Megillat Esther, and therefore it would emerge Megillat Esther is not part of Tanakh. Major chidush, but it's not part of Tanakh. Rabbi Lazar Modai argues, another Tana, and he says no, like we said before. Kitov Zot Masha Katuv Kan. Kitov Zot teaches us what's written here in Shemot, Uve Mishnat Torah, and also Melchemet Amalek is recorded in Dvarim, but that's all included in one part of the verse. Zikaron Masha Katuv Ben Vi'im. Now, when it says Zikaron, it means you could record Amalek a second time in Shmuel Aleph. Basefer Masha Katuv b'Megilla. So Basefer teaches us you recorded a third time in Megillat Esther. So therefore it comes out that the inclusion of Megillat Esther in Tanakh is based on the opinion of Rabbi Lazar Modai, who says that the two references of Torah are both one, and then you could include a third reference, i.e. Basefer, to include Megillat Esther as part of Tanakh. Beautiful. Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Now Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel says something based on this debate that's a bit of a chidush, but he says like this. We know the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat discusses this. This is on Daf Yudaled. The Chachamim made a very interesting takana regarding kisvei hakodesh. Kisvei hakodesh is holy writings. Anything that's included in Tanakh, we're going to talk about as kisvei hakodesh. The Chazal saw, the Chachamim saw that people used to store the kisvei hakodesh, their Sfarim, together with their truma. Now, why would they do that? Because truma is holy, and truma, which goes to the Kohen, it's holy, and kisvei hakodesh are holy, so they used to store them together. But the Chachamim saw there's a problem, because mice would come, they were attracted to the food, truma is food, and then what ended up happening was they would damage the kisvei hakodesh. They would damage the holy writings. So they made a takana the following, that kisvei hakodesh, it's a very big chidush, it has a level of tum'ah called sheni tum'ah, a certain level of tum'ah, and it would contaminate your hands when you touch them. So if you touch kisvei hakodesh, it makes your hands tameh. What does that accomplish? Because people were very machmir about truma. They didn't want their truma to become tameh. So they said, well, if the kisvei hakodesh are going to contaminate the truma, we're not going to store them together anymore, and thus the mice wouldn't chew through kisvei hakodesh. So rabbinically, at least, they made a takana that kisvei hakodesh make your hands tameh. But this is only by what we call kisvei hakodesh. Means the Gemara does not make my hands tameh. It's only by Tanakh. So whatever is included in Tanakh is included in this takana. It would make my hands tameh if I touch it. Okay? So now, based on that, the Gemara is about to show us, if you say that it's not metameh your hands, it doesn't make your hands tameh, so it sounds like you're saying that book is not part of Tanakh. That's the point here. So let's see that inside. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Esther enam metameh hayadayim. Megillat Esther does not make somebody's hands tameh. So the Gemara says, L'meimer, this would imply, Disavar Shmuel, that Shmuel holds, Esther la Ruach HaKodesh ne'emra, that Esther was not said in Ruach HaKodesh, meaning whatever's in Tanakh was said in Ruach HaKodesh and recorded, must be, this was not Ruach HaKodesh, this was just, it was a book that they wrote over. The problem is, the Ha'amar Shmuel, but Shmuel himself, which was Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, he just quoted that psak, Shmuel himself says, Esther Baruch HaKodesh Nemra, that it was said Baruch HaKodesh. It was said from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Mordechai to Esther, as we'll see sources later. Nemra, Baruch HaKodesh Nemra. So the Gemara answers, very interesting debate here, but the Gemara answers, Nemra likrot velo Nemra lichtov. Megillat Esther was said Baruch HaKodesh, but it was said likrot, to read it. It was meant to be of oral tradition, but it was not said to write it down. So this is a very interesting thing. Tanakh was meant to be written down. That's called Torah shebichtav. But according to this shita, really we paskin that like Rabbi Yehoshua, meaning Megillat Esther was not meant to be recorded, but it was still Baruch HaKodesh, but it was meant to be read orally. According to this shita, on Purim, what we would do is, we would repeat over Megillat Esther Baal Peh. You wouldn't read it out of a scroll, because it wasn't meant to be written down. So you would actually read it Baal Peh, because it wasn't meant to be written, but it was also Baruch HaKodesh, it just wasn't meant to be written down. We don't pass them like this.
Tanakh you writing?
Tanakh, all of Tanakh. Torah Shebaal Peh, Torah Shebichtav.
Yeah, but we don't write it.
Of course,
It's
written.
written.
It's written, of course.
It's already
It's
written.
reading, but
Reading.
we don't write. It's also reading Megillat Esther.
The point is that does that have inherent kedusha? Is that meant to be part of Tanakh? That's the debate here. That's exactly the debate.
But,
Yeah.
Esther, she said to the Rachamim, Kidevod,
Right.
Kivonis, or Ledoratot. So write me the story.
So this is going to be a
Maybe
point.
once, it was just once, and then everybody was learning by Cheval Pei.
Well, that's a point of machloket. That the conclusion of that story, they concluded and said, okay, we have a proof that there is a Tana who says it could be written down, but there also was the opposition. That's why they were initially they were hesitant. They said, we don't know if we could. Okay, they found a Tana, Belezer Amodai, who said it could be written down, part of Tanakh, but it wasn't so clear.
Okay.
Native, we have to also realize is we look at it as a book that's sitting on the shelf, but Tanakh came to be throughout the course of those generations. You know, when Yeshaya existed, he wrote down Sefer Yeshaya. Yirmiyah wrote down Sefer Yirmiyah, etc., etc. So it came to be. So could you include? Also, this is after Chorban Bayit Rishon. So we're talking about writing down. These are like the last books, really, that Lechara were included, because this is the end of Nevi'im, the period of prophecy. Really, this is Chagi Zechariah Malachi. That was the end of prophecy, the end of going back to the second temple, which is really the end of prophecy. So yeah. Meitavei, the Gemara says the problem is we have a Braita that says as follows. And we're going to go through an extended Braita, but it's going to challenge this premise. So let's see. Meitavei, Rabbi Meir, Omer Rabbi Meir says in the Braita, Kohelet eno mitamet hayadayim. So he says Kohelet does not contaminate the hands. Rabbi Meir holds Kohelet, which was written by Shlomo HaMelech, it was not included in Tanakh, so it doesn't make your hands tameh if you touch it. Umachloket b'shir hashirim. And there's a machloket regarding shir hashirim. Again, Shir Hashirim was also written by Shlomo HaMelech, right? Shir Hashirim. Rabbi Yossi, Omer Rabbi Yossi says Shir Hashirim etamet hayadayim. Shir Hashirim does contaminate your hands. A machloket bekohelet, and there's a machloket regarding kohelet. Rabbi Shimon Omer kohelet mikulei beit Shammai umechumrei beit Hillel. So Rabbi Shimon says kohelet is of the leniencies of Beit Shammai, and the chumrot, the stringencies, means that it is included in Tanakh and it contaminates your hands according to Beit Hillel. Avarut the Shir Hashirim, but regarding Rut and Shir Hashirim, the Esther and Megillat Esther mitaminet hayadayim, it does contaminate your hands. So the Gemara says, you see, everyone seems to hold that Megillat Esther is included in Tanakh. How could Shmuel say otherwise? The Gemara answers, Hu de Amar Reb Yeshua. Shmuel has a Tana. We already said Reb Yeshua says it wasn't meant to be written down, and therefore, since it wasn't meant to be written down, even though it was meant to be passed on orally by tradition, that's fine, but it doesn't have the significance of the writing like the rest of Tanakh. Tanya. So now on this topic, the Gemara continues. The Braita says, Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe Omer, Kohelet eno mitame et hayadayim. Kohelet. How do you translate Kohelet in English? Ecclesiastes, I think it's called in English. Ecclesiastes, I think it's called. Kohelet eno mitame et hayadayim. Kohelet does not contaminate the hands. This is Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe. Mipnei shechochmato shel Shlomo. This is an incredible statement. Kohelet is the chochma of Shlomo. It's the wisdom of Shlomo. It's not Baruch HaKodesh. It's not godly inspired. It's got it's his own chokhmah. Shlomo wrote down his own chokhmah. Okay.
It's not easy for the Chachamim just to make a takana. Don't put the food in there. And that's it. Instead of worry about which one.
Excellent question. Excellent question. A very good question. I want to tie back into that in a minute, but let's just finish this statement. That's a very good question. It really
so
gets,
many books. Yes, or Kodesh, not one.
No, but that's a different story. But you're asking on the takana. I'll get back to it in a minute. So the point is, Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe says it was just the chokhmah of Shlomo, and therefore Kohelet does not contaminate your hands. So Amru lo, the Chachamim said back to Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe, v'chizu b'levad amar, was this all that Shlomo HaMelech said? V'alo kvar ne'emar, we know the pasuk tells us in Melachim, when it talks about Shlomo HaMelech, vayidaber shloshet alafim mashal. It says Shlomo spoke 3,000 parables, right? 3,000 mishalim. He used to say over mishalim of chokhmah. That's what he used to say. Parables of chokhmah. The Omer, and furthermore, the pasuk says in Mishlei, al tosef al dvarav. Don't add on to, he didn't add on to his words. So the Gemara is Maiva Omer. What's the extra pasuk? What are the Chachamim arguing exactly? So the Gemara says like this. The first argument they're saying is, we know that Shlomo HaMelech had 3,000 parables. Now he didn't include all of that in Kohelet. So obviously, what's the logic? Because what he wrote in Kohelet was only things that were with Ruach HaKodesh. So the things that his own chokhmah, he didn't include necessarily. That's the point. Maybe you'll say, yeah, it's true that he had much more chokhmah, but some of it he wanted to write, some of it he didn't, but it's not necessarily Baruch HaKodesh. So Tashma, I'll show you from the next verse, Al Tosef El Devarav, he didn't add on to his words. Meaning, whatever he wrote in the Sfarim, Kohelet, etc., that wasn't just his own chokhmah, they're arguing. No, Al Tosef El Devarav, he didn't add on to his words. Meaning that there was Ruach HaKodesh, which was written down, and then his own chokhmah, that wasn't necessarily recorded, even though he had tremendous chokhmah. Okay, before we go ahead, I want to address what Yosef just said. A very important question, really, in general, how the Chachamim make takanot. If they wanted to avoid the kisvei hakodesh from being damaged, so what should they have established? Don't put the truma next to kisvei hakodesh.
Right.
Everybody hear that? It's just a very logical. Instead, they say that kisvei hakodesh contaminates your hands, which is it's much more of a stretch. Right. It's not true. Meaning, midoraita, if I touch the Sefer Torah, I touch Kitvei HaKodesh, it doesn't do anything to my hands. Mm-hmm. So the rabbis made a new level of Tumah, so I don't put the Truma next to the Kitvei HaKodesh. Just say, don't put the Kitvei HaKodesh next to the Truma. It's a very good question. It's interesting, in the Megilla this past week, somebody asked me a similar question. It seems to address the issue in a much more direct way, right? Mm-hmm. So the answer to that is, the Chachamim made takanot in ways they knew that people would upkeep them. It means they wanted to make it in the most effective way. People had already become accustomed to putting their Truma and Kitvei HaKodesh together. So the Chachamim thought, if we just make a takana, don't put it together, since they're so used to that already, they might not take it so seriously and they'll continue to do that. But they knew that the Chumrah of Truma in the minds of people was very strict. Uh-huh. So they said, if you put it near, and there is a tumah that it can contract. Meaning whenever Chachamim make takanot, they go into the head of the Hamon Am, the average people, how will this be fulfilled better? Mm-hmm. That's the idea. So you go throughout all the takanot of Chazal, it's always trying, what's going to be the most effective way to accomplish whatever it is that we're seeing is to resolve the issue at hand. Exactly. So maybe sometimes that's what's necessary a little bit. But then the Kitvei HaKodesh won't be damaged. Someone asked me a similar question. It's the same idea though.
That's why they're the Chachamim and
we're not. We just learned it, exactly. Tanya says the Braita. Now, this is actually a series of sources in Megillat Esther, that Megillat Esther was written with Ruach HaKodesh. Okay, with Ruach HaKodesh. Because we're going to quote a series of psukim that could have only possibly been known if HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling them to write it down. So let's see. Tanya. Says the Braita. Rav Eliezer says, the first proof. Esther Ruach HaKodesh Nemra. Esther was said at the Ruach HaKodesh, through Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. Shneimar, like the pasuk says, this is in Megillat Esther, Vayomer Haman belibo. Haman said in his heart. Now, what is this pasuk referring to? We know when Haman came to visit Achashverosh, he had built a gallows to hang Mordechai on, and Achashverosh said to him, what shall be done to the man that the king wishes to honor? So, Vayomer Haman bilibo, Haman said in his heart. The Megillat Esther says. So, Rabbi Eliezer says, how would we know, as the authors of Megillat Esther, what Haman was thinking in his head? Must be Ruach HaKodesh. That's the first proof. We're going to go through a series of proofs like this. Yomer Haman bilibo. Fine. Rabbi Akiva is the second proof. Esther Ruach HaKodesh Nemra. Esther was said Ruach HaKodesh Nemra, like it says, V'tehi Esther nos'et chen be'enei kol ro'eha. It says when they brought all the women and the king chose Esther, it says she found favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's this phenomenal concept that everybody who saw her appreciated her. Well, how do we know what everybody else is thinking theoretically? Meaning to say is, there must have been some miraculous element for us to know what everybody else is thinking. Everyone appreciated her beauty. How do we know? It must be it was Baruch HaKodesh. Rabbi Meir Omer, just 1 second. Yeah. Rabbi Meir says, Esther Ruach HaKodesh Nemra, Esther was said Ruach HaKodesh Nemra, like it says. Vayivada davar leMordechai. It says when Bigtan and what's the big what were their names? No, what were the names? There's two people. Two people were plotting against the king. What were their names? No? You have to remember. Getting there soon. It's the second chapter of the Megillah. Here. Bigtan and Teresh, these two people, were officers of Achashverosh, and they were upset. We'll talk about in the Masechet later why they were upset, and they were plotting to assassinate the king. They were going to kill the king, poison his water, he'll be dead. Mordechai understood what their plot was. He reported it back to the king, and this ended up being a precursor of the Geulah, what would eventually trigger the Geulah. So the pasuk tells us, "Vayivada davar leMordechai." The matter became known to Mordechai. And how did he know? So the Gemara says it was Ruach hakodesh. He couldn't have known otherwise. Now we're going to refute these proofs. So we're going to refute these proofs in a minute, but at this point we're saying the only way he could have possibly known was Ruach hakodesh. Yossi ben Dormaskit Omer Esther Baruch HaKodesh Nemra. It was Baruch HaKodesh Nemra, like it says, Uvebiza lo shalchu et yadam. When the Jews fight back eventually and conquer their enemies, and their enemies aren't able to hurt them, it says that the Jews didn't take anything from the spoils of war. Means they didn't touch any of the property of the Goyim, they didn't want to take any of it. So how could we possibly have known that not one Jew took something he wasn't supposed to? Must be, it was Baruch HaKodesh. Amar Shmuel. Now Shmuel commented after all these Tanaim said their proofs. Now Shmuel's an Amora, but Shmuel said, if I would have been there when they were discussing the proofs, I would have said the greatest proof of all of them. Because the pasuk says Kimu v'kiblu. There's a pasuk, it says that they established and they accepted. What does it teach us? Kimu lema'ala, that they established in Shamayim, mashakiblu lemata, what they had accepted below. What that means is when the Jews below accepted that there's going to be Purim and Mikra Megilla, in Shamayim, they agreed about that there will be such an enactment. So the Gemara Shmuel says, that's the greatest proof that this was Baruch HaKodesh, because we know what's going on in heaven. That's obviously Baruch HaKodesh. So Amar Rava commented and said, Lekulu itlu pircha lebar midishmuel. The four proofs that were brought by the Tanaim all could be refuted. They're not proofs necessarily, besides the last one of Shmuel, the letle pircha. He doesn't have a refutation. His proof is strong. Now let's go through them. Rabbi Eliezer, Yosef kind of alluded to this before, because Rabbi Eliezer's proof was Haman thought in his heart, who is the king referring to? So we don't have to have Ruach HaKodesh to know what he was thinking. Svarahu, it's logic. He was the highest officer of the kingdom. So when he started to say, give this person all kinds of good things, probably who is he referring to? Himself. Obviously he's referring to himself. So that's not necessarily Ruach HaKodesh. Now Rabbi Akiva's proof was, it says Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Dilma Kerb Elazar, we're going to have a drasha that explains that later. The Amar, there was a miracle that happened that Esther looked like the nationality of anyone who saw her. Means an African Tsar, she looked African to him. A European Tsar, she looked European.
Like
a Frenchman,
Haman.
What's that?
Like the Haman that you eat, you want steak, it tastes
like the man, exactly. So therefore, the Gemara, she found favor in everyone's eyes. Yeah, because it looked like she was from their nation. So Vahad Rabbi Meir, the third proof, which was Rabbi Meir, which is what Rabbi Meir said. The proof was that Mordechai knew what Bigtan and Teresh were plotting against the king. That's not a proof. Dilma Rabbi Chia bar Abba. That's like Rabbi Chia bar Abba explains. The Amar, Rabbi Chia bar Abba explained. Bigtan v'Teresh, these two officers, Shnei Tarshim hayu. They were from Tarshi. This was a country, I guess. They spoke a language. And as the Gemara is going to explain later, Mordechai was from the Sanhedrin. And because he spoke all 70 languages. So he spoke their language. He heard their conversation. That's not Ruach HaKodesh. He just heard what they were saying. Therefore, that's not a proof it was Ruach HaKodesh. And the final proof that the Jews didn't take anything from the spoils of war, Fahad Rab Yossi ben Dermaskit, Dilma Pristiku Shadur. Maybe they sent a message, an officer saying that the Jews didn't touch anything. So they sent a letter like that. That's not Ruach HaKodesh. But the Shmuel, where Shmuel said that in Shamayim they agreed to the Takana of Purim, Vaday let le pircha, there's no way to refute that. That's a strong proof. Amar Ravina commented, Hainu de Amre Inchi, this is like people say, you're going to like this one. Tavachara pilpalta charifta. Better is one sharp pepper, mimali tzani curry, from a basket full of melons. If you have an argument with someone, you can bring 4 proofs, but they're not such good proofs. Or you could say one zinger. The one zinger is much better. So Shmuel, his proof was stronger than the rest of them. Now the Gemara just says two final proofs. Rav Yosef Amar Mehacha. Rav Yosef says, the Pasuk tells us, these days of Purim will never pass from the Jewish people. Now that is predicting the future, that will never cease to keep Purim. So that has to be Ruach HaKodesh. It's telling us something about the future. The remembrance of Purim will never cease from amongst the Jewish people. Again, a similar idea, that has to be Ruach HaKodesh. Let's just start, even though we're running a little late here, but let's just start the next section as we turn the page. The Mishnah had told us matanot le'evyonim, that matanot le'evyonim, gifts to the poor, we said we're done in the second Adar. You know that there's two mitzvot. We have mishloach manot, which is to give food portions to another person, and matanot le'evyonim is also gifts to the poor. So the Gemara tells us here what is the minimal requirement to fulfill these mitzvot. So the Gemara says, Tani Rav Yosef, u'mishloach manot ish l're'eh. The pasuk says you send manot, portions, a man to his friend. That's food. And that teaches us as mishloach manot, so that's two, ish l're'ehu, a man to his friend. So it's one person to another person, and two portions of food. Shtei manot le'ish achad. So it teaches us to fulfill the minimal requirement is two food portions from one man to another. Umatanot le'evyonim, and when it says in the pasuk gifts to the plural, so there's a plurality there, that teaches us shtei matanot l'shnei bnei adam. That means that you give one gift of money to one poor person and another gift of money to another poor person. This is the minimal requirement. Now the Gemara tells the story of Yudah Nesiah Shadar Lei Rabbi Oshaya Itma de Igla Tilta Vigarva de Chamra. Rav Yudah Nesiah, who was the grandson of Rav Yudah Nasi actually, he sent to Rabbi Oshaya the thigh of a choice calf, meaning of an expensive piece of meat, and a bottle of wine. This was hit on Purim. So Shalach Lei, Rabbi Oshaya sent back, turning to Zayin Amud Bet, Kayamta Banu Rabbeinu, you have fulfilled in us, Umishloach Manot Ish L'Re'eyu. Take out the next words. They're not in our gears, actually. Take it out. You fulfilled the mitzvah, Mishloach Manot Ish L'Re'eyu, because you sent two food portions. You sent meat and you sent wine. That's two food portions. You fulfilled that mitzvah. Okay, we'll stop here because it's ready.
I would think they should
pick up tomorrow Zayin Amud Bet.
I think they should do